Elections are the central institution in the American system of representative democracy. At the federal level, the constitutionally scheduled cycle of elections sets the basic rhythm of political life. Elections don't just decide who controls the levers of power and whose agendas will drive decision making. Elections mobilize political action like nothing else in American life. The symbolic value of elections is equally important, since they realize the otherwise entirely abstract idea that in the United States, the people are sovereign. And since sovereignty is an expression of power as decision making, elections carry the weight of political legitimacy. The electoral decision, in principle, cuts through all other conflicts and renders an unappealable decision of the people. It is our most immediate and recognizable expression of democracy. At the heart of every political struggle in American history is the life and death question: who may take part in the civic rights of election? Who holds the right to cast a vote, the most visible symbol of citizenship? Who counts and who does not? In important ways, the individual act of voting is less important than the electoral structures that determine who can vote and how those votes are processed. American elections are conducted according to a strict and complex code of rules that determine every aspect of the process, as well as some of the outcomes. For our purposes, we will focus on federal elections, the races that determine who occupies the White House and the two chambers of Congress. But keep in mind that even by the standards of peer democracies, Americans elect a very high number of officials. From dog catchers to county treasurers to state senators and state Supreme Court justices, Americans elect their fellow citizens to office at rates that far exceed most other democracies. The first structural aspect of the system to note is the calendar the Constitution establishes. All 435 members of the House are up for election every 2 years. The 100 members of the Senate serve 6-year terms, but on a staggered schedule that means 1/3 of the chamber's seats are up for election every 2 years. The president is elected every 4 years. Presidential elections, because of their national scale, receive the most attention. These elections mobilize voters in every state for a variety of races, the outcome of which may dramatically alter the composition of the government. The elections held in the middle of a presidential term, called midterm elections, involve the whole House and 1/3 of the Senate, and while they are often extremely important in determining the direction of government, they attract far fewer voters than presidential years. Except in a tiny handful of exceptions, all the hundreds of elections held in any given year in the United States are conducted on a single member, first past the post rule. This means that in every election, there can only be one winner, and that winner is the candidate who gets at least one more vote than her nearest opponent. In a common two-person race, the winner is whoever receives 50% plus 1 of the vote. In a multi-person race, whoever gets the most votes wins, whether it is 49%, 30%, or less. The loser gets nothing. This may seem intuitive to us, but other countries use different systems. Some use proportional representation, in which voters choose parties rather than individual candidates. Legislative seats are awarded on the basis of a party's vote share, so a party that wins 40% of the vote gets 40% of the seats, while a party winning 10% of the vote gets 10% of the seats. In systems like this, multiple political parties are common. But in our winner-take-all system, smaller parties have very little chance of winning enough seats to wield power, while the two major parties manage coalitions that, depending upon the state, can reliably deliver electoral majorities. This is one reason why many political movements that in other countries would have become political parties in their own right are either absorbed into one of the two major American parties, or, more rarely, an outside movement hijacks one of the parties and uses it to try to adopt its own agenda. This was the case with the populists and the Democrats in the 1890s, and more recently the conservative takeover of the Republican Party since the late 1960s. While the Constitution is silent on the method of elections that each state should use, it does make the electoral schedule immutable. No crisis has ever postponed or canceled a federal election. This ironclad schedule is also unusual within pure democracies, and has contributed to a political culture deeply committed to procedural conservatism, a deep and defensive attachment to holding elections in conformity with established norms. It should be noted that this conservatism is not incompatible with a long and complex history of electoral corruption and manipulation. This very rarely takes the form of outright electoral theft, although that has certainly happened. The more common tactics used to shape the outcome of elections, outside of the basic rules of competition, involve shaping the rules of the game in ways that automatically favor some players over others. This kind of systemic manipulation is an old feature of American politics, one that regularly occupies the energies of political parties and leaders. The wholesale exclusion of women, slaves, and natives is obvious, but property qualifications that reserved the vote to the affluent persisted until the 1840s. The attempt to found an interracial democracy after the Civil War failed and gave way to the Jim Crow system that made the old Confederate states one-party racial dictatorships, in which white supremacist Democrats monopolized power by excluding African Americans. But electoral manipulation need not be so obvious. Consider the proud American tradition of gerrymandering. Each state is allotted a certain number of House seats based on its population. That number is determined by the census, held every 10 years. In the first Congress, each representative spoke for about 30,000 Americans. Now, each representative speaks for about 500,000 Americans. Since 1912, the number of representatives has been fixed at 435. There were 92 million Americans in 1912. Today, there are 330 million. So after the census reports which states have gained or lost population, or held steady, House districts are redrawn to reflect those changes in population. This means that every 10 years, 50 state legislatures are charged with redrawing their state's House district borders. As you might expect, the party that controls a given state legislature has an interest in drawing lines that favor their party's House candidates. So one perennial theme in American politics is a constant battle over the size and shape of House districts, the outcomes of which can decisively shape the country's political dynamics. In 1812, Elbridge Gerry, Democratic-Republican governor of Massachusetts, signed a redistricting bill that offered surreal, ludicrously drawn district lines that just so happened to massively favor the Democratic-Republicans over their opponents in the Federalist Party. Bemused opponents likened the snaking district to a salamander, hence gerrymandering. The purpose of gerrymandering is to construct districts that systematically favor one party over another. This is done by drawing districts in order to create the electorate that a majority party wants, designed so that one party can claim a majority of House seats even if they do not receive as many total votes as their rival party. This can be accomplished in two general ways: cracking and packing. Consider states like North Carolina. In both states, large Democratic cities are surrounded by Republican rural and suburban areas. Republicans can readily win rural areas, but run into a wall of urban Democratic votes that prevent them from dominating the state government or its congressional delegation. One solution, pursued by Republican-controlled legislatures, is to crack these Democratic cities, slicing them into pieces and attaching them to the nearest reliably Republican district. If it works, Democratic voters in cities like Charlotte are split into 2 or 3 safely Republican districts. These urban Democrats can vote all they want, but they are bound to be swamped by the Republican majority they share a gerrymandered district with. Packing can take two forms. A majority party might draw districts that concentrate their most reliable votes and create safe seats. Or they might concentrate their opponent's most reliable votes in districts that limit their voting power. A Republican legislature, for example, could sacrifice one seat to the Democrats in order to create 3 competitive seats that lean in their direction. Racial politics play a large role here, especially in former Confederate states that until recently were governed by the Voting Rights Act. Black Southerners are overwhelmingly Democratic, while most whites vote Republican. Gerrymandering designed to dilute the voting power of African Americans is common in the South. Northern gerrymandering also aimed at diluting the black vote, but this was an adaptation of older patterns of gerrymandering designed to limit the power of immigrants, especially Catholic Irish and Germans in the 19th century. Gerrymandering has never been found unconstitutional, as other equally egregious forms of manipulation have been. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 aimed to strike down the battery of voter suppression tactics used to maintain white supremacy in the South. And until the Supreme Court struck down parts of the Voting Rights Act in 2013, the law made it substantially easier to vote. This was, in part, due to a requirement that any change a southern state wanted to make to its election rules, no matter how small, had to be cleared by the Justice Department in Washington. This rule was struck down by the Supreme Court in Shelby County versus Holder, and since then, several states have altered their voting rules in order to change the electorate. Some recent tactics updated for the 21st century include Alabama passing a law requiring an ID to vote, then closing down DMVs in majority black counties, or Georgia Secretary of State Brian Kemp, who oversaw the election system in his state, purged more than 100,000 voters from the rolls on specious grounds, and then narrowly won the race for governor in 2018. In Florida, a ballot initiative to restore voting rights to ex-convicts passed by a huge majority in 2018, only to be rendered null and void by Republicans in the state legislature and their allies in the courts. And of course, in the unfolding 2020 election, we see all sorts of efforts to suppress the vote in what will likely be the highest turnout election in a century. Whether this involves Texas Governor Greg Abbott mandating a single drop-off location for mail-in votes in counties with millions of people, or deliberately underfunding and understaffing voting locations in majority-minority districts, the struggle for the right to vote goes on across the country. Finally, let's look at the most famous and consequential of American voting institutions, the Electoral College. The Constitutional Convention was divided over the question of how to elect the president, and the Electoral College emerged as a compromise to address the interests of anti-democratic elites across the country, Southern slaveholders especially. Per the Constitution, the president is elected by the members of the Electoral College, which is called into being every 4 years only for the purposes of electing a president. Each state is given a number of electoral votes equal to their congressional representation. So, New York has 29 votes to account for its 27 House members and 2 senators. California and Texas are at the top of the heap with 55 and 38 electoral votes respectively. Many of the smallest states have 3 electoral votes, reflecting their 2 Senate seats and single statewide House district. Yet another reason the census is so important. States gain or lose electoral votes as they gain or lose population, which alters the entire political calculus of elections. Today there are a total of 538 electoral votes. Whichever candidate can claim 270 of these votes wins the presidency. The voters thronging to the polls this year are casting their ballots not for Joe Biden or Donald Trump directly, but for slates of electors pledged to vote for one or the other of the candidates when the Electoral College formally meets in December. Though there is a lot of controversy over the question of faithless electors, members of the college who vote for another candidate in defiance of voters' expressed preference, this is not a factor likely to affect the outcome of a given election. Other aspects of the system structure are more important to determining outcomes. Crucially, the same first-past-the-post, winner-take-all logic applies. If a candidate wins 50% plus 1 of a state's vote, that candidate gets the entire haul of a state's electoral votes. The loser gets nothing. 2 exceptions illustrate the point. Maine and Nebraska each allot their electoral votes based on the state's congressional districts. So Donald Trump won an electoral vote from a conservative rural district in Maine in 2016, while in 2008, Barack Obama won an electoral vote in Nebraska based in the city of Omaha, a feat Joe Biden looks likely to replicate. But in every other case, a bare majority rules. This is one reason why presidential elections focus on a small handful of swing states. Depending on the political balance of power in a given year, each party can tally up its reliable electoral college votes. Democrats can take California and New York for granted, while Republicans can do the same in Texas and Mississippi. From here on out, it's a math problem. Given your starting point, what is the easiest and most reliable path to 270 votes? Based on the relative balance of power between Democrats and Republicans nationwide, a few states become ground zero for electioneering. States like Florida, Ohio, and North Carolina are modern examples. Campaigns invest huge amounts of resources into must-win states. In effect, the half dozen or so swing states are really the only ones that matter in most presidential races. This fact undermines the key argument usually made by supporters of the Electoral College, that it exists to give a voice to small states that would otherwise be drowned out in presidential elections by the voters in big states. This is nonsense. Small rural states derive no real advantage from the Electoral College. Since they are virtually never swing states and are typically deep red or deep blue, they are ignored by candidates. Ask voters in North Dakota or Vermont how often they're solicited by a presidential campaign. The Electoral College also disenfranchises opposition voters in reliably Democratic or Republican states. New York is full of Republican voters who exercise power at the state level, but their presidential votes are altogether useless. Since New York is certain to deliver its electoral votes to the Democratic candidate, Republicans gain nothing by casting presidential votes. The same could be said of Democrats in Mississippi or Montana. I'll note, though, that these dynamics do change, though it takes decades. California, for example, is the foundation of any Democratic Electoral College victory. But it is only since 1992 that Democrats could rely on a state that overwhelmingly backed both Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. Virginia, a former Confederate state that last backed a Democrat in 1964, has since 2008 become a reliably Democratic state thanks to long-term demographic changes. And of course, the Electoral College makes it possible for a candidate to win the presidency even if that candidate receives fewer popular votes. In 2016, Hillary Clinton won 3 million more popular votes than Trump. But since most of these votes came from states she already won, they serve no effective purpose under our system. Since you only need 50% plus 1 vote to win a state, a majority plus 2 or 2 million is essentially pointless. And since a candidate can assemble a 270 electoral vote coalition out of states that contain a minority of voters, presidents like George Bush and Donald Trump have exercised power despite never receiving the endorsements of a majority of the country's voters. Like so much of our Constitution, the Electoral College remains intact because of the deep conservatism of American attitudes toward the Constitution. If it was good enough for the founders, it's good enough for us. But the historical record is more complex. Originally, under the Electoral College, the runner-up became vice president. It became immediately clear that making a defeated rival the president's colleague was a bad idea. In the 1800 election, 11 years after the ratification of the Constitution, the whole system froze up, and the election was only narrowly resolved by the House of Representatives. Many of the authors of the Constitution were actors in this particular drama, and they admitted frankly that the system they designed in Philadelphia had unanticipated flaws. Subsequent crises in 1824 and 1876 were treated as anomalies, and in the vast majority of elections, the Electoral College outcome aligned with the popular vote, which dampened efforts to revise or abolish it. But in 2 of the past 5 presidential elections, the popular vote loser nevertheless won the electoral vote and became president. Though constitutionally acceptable, the idea that the candidate with fewer popular votes can still win the White House offends democratic values of majority rule. If the recent trend of popular vote losers assuming the presidency and governing as if they won huge majorities continues, there is a serious danger that the practices of governing will diverge farther and farther from norms of democratic acceptability, setting the stage for another major political crisis over the fundamental question of whose votes count and whose do not.